Alright, so before we ever push any pixels or write any code, we first need to start planning out our application. I just have a blank document here that we're going to use to think through our application. So we are going to be planning our app. So what we need to do is a few things. We need to answer some questions. We need to write some user stories. We need to model our data. And then finally, we need to think through the pages we want or we need in our application. So first off, let's do the questions. So the first one would be, what exactly are we building? Next one could be, who are we building it for? And then what features do we want to have? So let's answer those. So the first one, what are we building? Well, we are building a podcasting network. It's going to be a place for podcast creators to add episodes of their podcast for their audiences to listen to. Who are we building it for? Well, we kind of answered that with question 1. So we are building it for podcast creators. And as a side effect, we are building it for the podcast's audience. And then what features do we want to have? Well, I found that finding the features is best done through user stories. So let's go down here and add user stories. So user stories are written in a very specific way from the perspective of a user. For example, as a user, I want to blank because of blank. So that could be, as a user, I want to be able to explore / discover new podcasts that I can, or so that I can find new stuff to listen to. Another one could be, as a user, I want to be able to sign up and create a podcast so that my audience can listen to my episodes. These other ones will be slightly tweaked just because after you sign up, you are then an authorized user. So as an authorized user, I want to be able to sign in and out so that I can access my account. So what else? We would need to obviously add episodes. So as an authorized user, I want to be able to add podcast episodes so that my audience can listen. We also would want the ability to edit and destroy podcasts. So as an authorized user, I want to be able to edit or delete my podcast episodes so that I can manage my podcast. We probably want to add a thumbnail to each episode so that each one can be uniquely recognized. So I'm going to say, as an authorized user, I want to be able to add images, or thumbnails rather, to my podcast episodes so that each episode can be uniquely recognized. And then a podcast network would not be a podcast without the ability to upload MP3s. So as an authorized user, I want to be able to upload MP3s. And one thing I forgot up here is, as a user, I want to be able to listen to podcast MP3s. For example, we would need a podcast or a MP3 player on the episode pages. So this answers our question to number 3, which would be what features do we want to have? We want users, aka podcasts, to be able to sign up and sign in/out. We'd also want authentication so that a user can only access their own content. We'd want the crudability, or rather create, read, update, and destroy ability for podcast episode. We would want image uploading, MP3 uploading. We'd want to store the assets on something like Amazon S3. And we would also want to launch our application live on a hosting service like Heroku. All right, so we have now answered those questions and then written our user stories. So the next thing we need to do is model our data. So I'm just going to write data, and then we are going to have 2 main models for this application. Since it's fairly simple, a user is going to be a podcast. They're going to be one and the same. So we are going to have a podcast model, and each podcast is going to have episodes. So we're going to have a separate episode model. And then in terms of relationships, a podcast is going to have, or a podcast has many episodes. And a episode belongs to a podcast. Belongs to a podcast. Now, what about the attributes on each table? So for the podcast, we'd obviously want an email and password so people can, or so they can log in and out. We'd also want a title, a description, a thumbnail image, also an episode count so we can keep track of how many episodes each podcast has. And then we also want links. For example, if podcast wanted to link to iTunes or maybe Stitcher. And then there's also Podbay. So we'll add those as well. And then for the episode would have a title, also a description. We are going to also have a podcast ID so that the episode can reference the podcast, and then a thumbnail, and also an MP3, because you can't have a podcast without having an MP3. So this seems good for now. If we think of any later down the road, we can definitely add those by running a migration on our model. But for now, let's move on to thinking through the pages in our application. This will help us in our next step, which is wireframing how the user will flow through our application. So when a user lands on our homepage, we would want them to see a welcome page. So say welcome page. And for this, we're going to have a welcome controller and an index action. And then if they already have an account, we want them to be able to sign in, which would be a session new. And these are the routes I am talking about. So I'll explain that more when we get to the process of building out our application. We also want sign up, which would be a registration new. We'd want a page that lists out all of our podcasts, which would be a podcast controller index action. We'd want a podcast single page that would list through all of the various episodes a podcast has. So I'll say podcast single, which would be podcast show. And then we'd have a podcast edit page so they can edit the podcast content, which would be a podcast edit action. Next, we would have a episode page. So if they clicked on an episode from the podcast show page, they would go to an episode show page, which would be an episode controller and a show action. And then obviously we'd want to have the ability to create a new episode. So episode new. And then also an episode edit, which would be episode controller, edit action. And then when a user is not signed in, they will see the welcome page. If they are signed in, the root of the application will be a dashboard page, which gives them the option to edit the information about the podcast or create a new episode, edit an episode, etc. So for this, it's going to live in the podcast controller dashboard action. But I think this leaves us in a good position to begin our next step, which is wireframing the user flow, how a user will go through our application.